Welcome to Tanach Study and to Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you're watching Archaeology Snapshot. And today we are covering Chumash Vayikra. In Sefer Study, we aim to cover the following aspects of each Sefer. When is the story happening? Who are the players? Where are they located? And some highlights from history and archaeology. Now before we go on, I just want to mention that there are many pictures, including the background picture, that we're going to be using today, which are from the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, and I have explicit permission from the founder of Israel Ariel, who's my neighbor, to use them for educational purposes, and in those cases I'm not going to be listing the credit other than the fact that it says it in the back of every single slide, and I have again the explicit permission. Without further ado, let's go into the when and the where. So when exactly and where is Sefer Vayikra taking place? The first part of Sefer Vayikra is happening in year 1 of leaving Mitzrayim. We left Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, and we're going to call that year 1 from now. And that's when we crossed Yam Suf and went into Midbar Sinai. Next, of course, we come to Har Sinai. This is one of the locations of where Har Sinai probably was. We get the Torah, and then we lead up to Parashat Shmini, which happens in this Chumash, which is on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the 1st of Nisan of year 2. And this particular day of Chanukat HaMishkan actually shows up 3 different times in the Torah, each one from a different perspective and a different aspect of it. Sefer Vayikra ends at the shadow of Har Sinai, where we are back at Har Sinai with the story of Behar Bechukotai, without getting into the question of is it chronological or not. And that's pretty much all I have to say about the when and the where. And as for the who, I don't really know what to say about that, because nobody knows what it's like to be the bad man or to be the sad man behind blue eyes. But about Nadav and Avihu, who are the who, I will spare just a few words, and that is, only the good die young. Now let's get into some highlights. The highlights in Sefer Vayikra are many varied and interesting subjects. We're going to get just into a few of them and take a moment to see the ones we're going to be talking about. We're going to kick this off talking about the namesake of Sefer Vayikra, which has to do with avodah, with Korbanot. It's called Leviticus because of the avodah, the service of Shevet Levi. Now, Vayikra feels very distant to us modern people, yet it was an important role for humanity for millennia. So we want to understand what exactly is this pull, this desire to serve God through bringing animal sacrifice, through bringing Korbanot. So we pray for the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash so that we can bring Korbanot again. So, let's just try to figure out how deep does this desire run in order to understand what it is that we are praying for and why that is so important. So let's briefly review the idea. Well, look here in the Mishkan, we have the Mizbeach and Nechoshet, which you can see the Kohanim putting together. Again, this was a traveling Mizbeach, so you'd fill in this copper or bronze frame as you would travel with it. This is the Mizbeach and Nechoshet. When we come into Eretz Canaan, into Eretz Israel, Yehoshua builds a Mizbeach in Har Eval. This is a Mizbeach in Har Eval, which Professor Adam Zartal suggests may be that very Mizbeach. Now, during the first temple period, and in fact from the period of the Mishkan through the first temple period, we have the Nevi'im constantly reprimanding us about the serving of God on Mizbechot, on Bamot, which are outside of the Mishkan, outside of the Beit HaMikdash. And this example is a Mizbeach from Tel Sheva, which was probably also used for Avodah Zarah. And my friend Erez and I are here posing a scene from Tanach. I'm going to let you guess what the story is, and this is in the Israel Museum. So this is just one of many Mizbechot that have been found in Eretz Israel. And in fact, animal sacrifice has been found throughout Eretz Israel. From left to right, you have Philistine Gat, you have the Canaanite Megiddo, and you have, of course, the Greeks in the 1st, 2nd century BCE in Israel serving. And this image in the back from an amphora shows you Greeks offering a pig on a Mizbeach, and this is a Mizbeach, an altar of the Greeks. And so this is very, very popular throughout many different cultures, and you find it throughout the ancient Near East. It's very, very primal. Now, the drive for animal sacrifice actually goes way, way, way back, and I would like to suggest an idea which perhaps will help us appreciate it a little bit more. The idea of animal sacrifice, the desire to serve an animal in some way, shape, or form, to burn it, to elevate it, and bring it as a korban, may come from the connection that we have to animal life, which goes way back to a time in which animals and humanity were living much closer together. And we understood animal life, and we understood, you could possibly call it the circle of life, on a much deeper and primal level. Because if you're not hunting, you might even be hunted by a saber-toothed tiger. And so we sort of commemorated animals and created rituals around hunting them, recognizing that we are all indeed part of the circle of life, and perhaps that's where that drive for Korbanot later on comes from. The modern person sort of lost touch with our connection to animals, but in fact, we get shocked or even disgusted when the truth of where animal food comes from is revealed. But yet Korban actually comes from the word karov, close. It's not sacrificing, it's getting closer to God by elevating, being makriv, by elevating more primitive or less sophisticated life forms to a higher level to serve humanity's purpose. So I don't know if the third Beit HaMikdash is going to come down with a blazing fire. I don't know how it's going to be built, but one thing is for certain. If we want to really appreciate the Beit HaMikdash, to know what we're praying for, we need to understand better the nature of Korbanot if we are to truly hope for its rebuilding. The next thing we're going to talk about has to do as well with an aspect which we've sort of become a little bit removed from, and that has to do with incense, with Ketoret. Even though we read about it in the Tefillah every day, this was an essential part of Avodah, which Am Yisrael sort of forgot and lost as our Avodah, our prayer became, well, prayer, and it became very intellectual as opposed to very sensual. Now, an essential part of the senses in the Beit HaMikdash and in the Mishkan was, of course, the Ketoret, which the Kohen Gadol would bring in to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, as you see here in image, or this is Aharon HaKohen, but also Bezot Yavo Aharon El HaKodesh, but also every Kohen Gadol in Yom HaKippurim. And this Ketoret comes from a special altar, a golden Mizbeach called Mizbach HaKetoret, a wooden gold-plated altar Mizbeach, which was right outside the Kodesh HaKodeshim and which was used for that purpose. Now, why exactly are we using Ketoret? Well, first of all, imagine the smell of a slaughterhouse. I mean, there's animals being slaughtered all the time, guts and gore. That can be pretty smelly. But not only that, it's pleasant, it's nice, and it is serving God with our senses, which is something that we have become a little bit distant from, especially today with the heavily intellectual approach. Well, in ancient Egypt, they used incense. Well, they also did that. In ancient Egypt, they used incense as well. And in fact, the dedication of the Mishkan, which we read about here in Parashat Shmini, but also shows up again with the Korbanot HaNesi'im in Chumash Bamidbar, was supported with the incense shovels, the Kaf Achat Mele'ah Ketoret, which each Nasi brought as part of the dedication of the Mishkan. And these kapot literally means a palm full of incense, Kaf Achat Mele'ah Ketoret. Obviously, it means an incense shovel or an incense burner. This is an example of an incense shovel from ancient Egypt. I took this picture at the Carlos Museum at Emory in Atlanta. And this is a Kaf Achat Mele'ah Ketoret, which is really, really cool. But there are many different forms of incense shovels and incense stands and incense altars from the ancient Near East, and these all were found in Israel, whether they are from Jewish or they are Roman or they are Philistine or they are Canaanite. These are common throughout the ancient Near East. People infused the service of God or their gods or the idolatry, but service itself, ritual itself, with using other senses as well. Things need to be beautiful, there needs to be music, there need to be good smells. Imagine going to synagogue when there's all of this experiential stuff. And now imagine how difficult and challenging it is to serve God when there's nothing to see, right? It's just such a challenge. So you can understand why people are driven to this much more enticing way of serving God. Now, speaking of bamot, unless you've been living under a rock, you surely have heard about the Mizbeach from Tel Arad, and this is it in the Israel Museum, but it's from Israel South, a first temple period sanctuary found in the Jewish city of Arad, and which was discovered to have had cannabis, weed, burned on its mizbeach. You can see it right there above the first few steps on the left. And this substance was analyzed very, very recently, and it was published just this past year. Now, if you're going to have a breakaway minyan, which is really what a bama, so to speak, is, the rabbi's not always going to approve of what you do, but you may as well have fun. And look at the bright side of it. These guys are actually going to shul, and not on Shabbat. They're going during the weekday. So this breakaway minyan actually worked. Now, how do you know this was during the weekday? Anyone have a light? Hope you got that one. Moving on. So speaking of Tum'ah and Tahara, ritual purity, when you're dealing with eating Korbanot, especially Kohanim, but in general, you need to be much more sensitive of ritual purity and impurity, of Tum'ah and Tahara. And so one of the most famous features of Jewish architecture from the Second Temple period is mikvaot. Now this mikveh is from Hebron, and when dealing with korbanot, of course, you constantly need to be concerned with Tumah and Tahara, so they had these in many different places, in public places, in private houses. In Jerusalem, many mikvot have been found inside people's houses. So this, for example, is from Jerusalem, from the city of David. And what you can see here is basically explaining a Mishnah that wouldn't make sense without seeing it, is if you find a vessel, a kli, which was taken to the mikveh in order to immerse it in the mikveh, how do you know if it's tameh and taho? Well, if it's on the stairs going down, then it was forgotten there, then it's tamen. If it's on the stairs going up, it's taho. Well, how do you know? Look at that divider in between and you'll get the idea. People knew one way is going down and one way is going up. Now, another very interesting feature which has to do with Tum'ah and Tahara, and incidentally also relates to the Trumah of the Mishkan, but that's Parashat Kitisa, and also Parashat Bamidbar, is the idea of measurements. Shekel, Beka, Kesef. Right? Stone measurements are very rare and more typical of Judah in the First Temple period. This is from the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech and later. These are all shekel measurements which you would use in business, in the marketplace, and of course they're passing hands a lot. And one thing that's important about stone is that it's eino mekabel tumah. Stone does not absorb ritual impurity, and therefore you can use it and it can pass hands. And so unlike other measurements in the ancient Near East, which are made of metal usually, in the Kingdom of Judah in the First Temple period, they're made of stone, which means that you can keep on handling them and you don't really need to worry about Tum'ah and Tahara. Now to the right here are stone vessels, which are typical of the Herodian period, of the late Second Temple period and going into the period shortly after that. These have been found also in many houses of Kohanim, of course, because Kohanim, like myself, have to be careful with Tum'ah and Tahara in order to handle Taharot and to eat Kodashim, right? And so this is a great little trick that you can use where you have your vessels made out of stone. These were found also in Qumran, a community which was very well known for their hypersensitivity to Tumah and Tahara. Now, as I mentioned, since I'm a Kohen, obviously I have to do the picture, and this is me holding one of those stone vessels from the Second Temple period in a private collection in the Old City. Lots of fun. Moving on, because it's about time to talk about time. Time and land, time and agriculture. Now, agriculture is an integral part of life, and especially the Chagim and the Moadim all revolve around the agricultural cycle. Chag HaAsif, Chag HaKatzir, Chag HaAviv, and this made sense to people intuitively, and it's part of the appreciation of Eretz Yisrael. Now, the laws which are brought up in Behar B'chukotai, the laws of Shemitah v'Yovel, of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee, tie intimately into the appreciation of the land. It's special halachot about how to treat the land and how the land doesn't really belong to us because we need to learn how to relinquish control. And every 7 years we let it lay fallow, we don't control it. There's special halachot of Shemitah which are kept today in Eretz Yisrael midrabanan. Now, the concern with time as part of the agricultural cycle, of course, became part of our synagogue service and decoration when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. And so a typical Byzantine period synagogue will have a zodiac in the center, which corresponds to the tefillot which were written at the time, prayers which we still have until today, prayers which are about 1600 years old. And these prayers, tefillat geshem, tefillat tal, praying for rain, which is what will be happening in the Beit HaMikdash with our korbanot. And a lot of these tefillot deal with the zodiac, the mazalot, and they have to do with the 4 seasons and so on. So this is an example, which is a synagogue from Beit Alpha. There's many, many more just like it. Now, how exactly do you measure time? Well, we're used to using the Seder Olam's counting of time. Today is the year 5781, more or less. Not going to get into the mysteries around that. But these inscriptions, which are actually tombstones from a Jewish settlement in the eastern Jordan called Tzoar, cities also mentioned in Tanach, use 2 different dating systems. One of them is the cycles of Shemitah, not Yovel, because after the exile of the 10 tribes, we no longer count Yovelot, because you need the majority of Am Yisrael to be in Eretz Yisrael. Fun fact. But they count Shmitot. And on the bottom part of these tombstones, it mentions years to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So we're using different dating systems that we don't use anymore, but which were common in the late Roman or actually in the Byzantine period and later, which is really, really cool. Now, let's move on to the next one. And of course, we must pay homage to Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, this respect is due especially because Sean Connery just passed away a few days ago, as you know, and even though he's not in this film, obviously, I must mention it. The Aron HaBrit, the Aron HaEdut, is the place where we put the Luchot, and it was kept in the Holy of Holies, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. It's the Ark of the Covenant, the Edut. It's a testament to God's relationship with us. Now, in the ancient Near East, it was actually customary and common when you have a treaty, whether it's between a vassal and a kingdom or some other sort of treaty, that you would have to keep a copy of the covenant in the temple sanctuary. That's what the treaty stipulated. And why would you do that? Just imagine that the treaty itself, the edut, needs to be in front of the gods and needs to constantly be in our memory, which means that this idea of having the covenant in the Kodesh HaKodeshim was known in the ancient Near East and would have made sense to us. But what was the essence of this covenant? So last but not least, the idea of freedom and slavery, avdut v'cherut, and with that we're going to wrap up. Ancient Near Eastern law codes, such as Hammurabi, as we've mentioned, speak about slaves. They have a lot of different laws about a slave who escaped, etc., and they treat slaves as property. The Torah, our Holy Torah, stands apart from all of these laws in its unique treatment of slaves. It treats them fairly in ways which are unfathomable at the time. And the laws of Eved Ivri and Ama Ivriya, a Hebrew slave or maidservant, treat them sometimes with more preference than yourself or your own spouse. You really have to treat them well. So this was definitely unimaginable in the ancient Near East. But the idea of freedom and slavery coming out of Egypt in Har Sinai with the Brit that ends Chumash Vayikra has an important place not only in the Chumash, but also for us, for Am Yisrael and the Torah in general. We always speak about Zecher L'Yitziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. Egypt is called Beit Avadim, the house of slavery. And that's because the country itself was built on the concept of being subservient to the pharaohs who ruled the Nile. And if you're successful with your produce as a farmer in the Nile, well, guess who takes all the credit for that? And so these massive monuments were built to eternalize the pharaohs who were seen as sort of gods. And so there is no personal freedom. And many scholars will tell you that the idea of individual freedom was revolutionary in Egypt. The common Egyptian never thought of it. Your personal freedom does not exist. It's only the pharaohs. They are literally and metaphorically at the top of the pyramid. But our Brit, the essence of our covenant, is to get rid of all of that. And this is where Hashem tells us, Ani Hashem Elokechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lahem avadim. I've taken you out of Egypt from being slaves. Va'ishbor motot olechem va'olech etchem komemiut. I broke the yoke of your slavery, and you will walk up with your head held high as free men and women, free to serve God. Because at the end of the day, the essence of the covenant and the essence of our avodah itself, our service and our korbanot, is to be free. And that is the main point. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see you next time for Sefer Study on Chumash Bamidbar. Please follow us. I hope you enjoyed the video. Sign up, subscribe, wherever it is that you watch podcasts or videos or however it is you want to see this. Until next time.